Hi, everybody.
Hi, everyone. Ashley, I've been doing some thinking and some digging. I have a question for you.
All right, let's hear it.
Okay. So, what if there was a way for our healthcare outcomes to be better, for people to feel more satisfaction, say if they're in pain, to report lower levels of pain, have fewer ER visits, also for people to be healthier, to be more productive at work, for an employee to have like a greater sense of belonging, and for us generally to feel better in society. Is that something you'd be interested in?
Well, I think that's something a lot of people would be interested in.
Well, luckily I've got a little pill for that we can make that. No. So it turns out, though, that there is a way, and it's not some technology or a drug or a pill. It's not even, we don't even have to throw money at it. Okay, it's something that, yes, it is just deeply human and something really that we are all capable of. And that's empathy.
Wow.
Right? Empathy is so important. We have seen study after study that when doctors practice empathy, we see patient outcomes improve. When leaders are more empathic and show more empathy, workplaces thrive. Okay, and when communities embrace empathy, we do see that people feel more connected and are therefore more resilient. So something that we have to think about, though, and I'm gonna ask us about this, or we're gonna talk about this. While we all think we understand empathy, I want to say, do we know what it really means? So today we're gonna dive into empathy. Right. I also want us to talk about things that can get in the way of empathy, but also ways that we can foster empathy.
Yeah, I love that. I think empathy is a great topic. Well, first we can kind of get into the history of it. I don't know if anyone listening actually knew, I did not know this, that the word empathy actually started out as an art term. So it actually comes from a German word, Einfühlung. I'm probably mispronouncing that. Einfühlung, which actually means feeling into. And originally it was about how people emotionally connected with things like paintings or music, the way we could project ourselves into something that's outside of us. But over time, they started to shift that idea and moved it from more art forms to people. So psychologists and I'm sure other providers started using it to explain how we, feel into each other, how we pick up on what someone else might be going through, even if they don't say anything, even if they don't communicate, what's going on. It's like that ability to tune in. And that shift from looking at empathy as something between like us and some other sort of external object to then something that exists between two people really started to change how we understood human connection, which I think is pretty cool.
Yeah, that's really, I think there's something cool about that too. Okay, so can we pause here for a second and kind of sit with, I want to talk about, this Einfühlung a little bit more. So it started, what you're saying is started from art and then was shifted into how we may feel into each other.
Well, yeah. And if you think about it, I mean, I've been to so many art galleries and museums in my life. You can stand in front of a painting. I guess you can have both experiences. You can stand in front of a painting and not have any type of connection or emotional reaction to it. But then you can stand in front of something and have an overwhelming emotional response to something that someone has created. And it's sort of interesting because in many ways, I actually think empathy being born out of this idea that okay, I'm connecting with this painting or with music. I actually think there is a human element to that because somebody, a human, created that piece of artwork and now it has generated within you this certain emotional response. And I think that that's really I think that's a key element of being a human, right? I mean, we're going to get into sort of how this works from a neurological perspective and go into the neuroscience just a little bit, which I think is very cool. But this is a sort of relating to and connection with a person. And it was really interesting that they started to identify that with things like art forms, because I think every human being can describe an experience where they've heard a certain song and it's brought them to tears, or they have, again, stood in a museum and looked at a painting where they just felt maybe this surge of emotion, and probably a similar emotion maybe to what the person who created that art, might have felt at the time that they created it.
Sure. I'm curious about that. Would that be a sense of connection through that emotion?
Well, I think so. I mean, I think this whole idea of feeling into someone else, to me, that seems very connective.
Yeah. Well, the reason I ask is, you said, bring up the neuroscience behind it. I'm thinking about something called mirroring neurons.
Mm-hmm.
They're a specialized, and I'll dig into it a little bit more, but a specialized type of neuron that essentially helps us to stay connected and be connected with one another.
Mm-hmm.
There's, I think, some interesting things that when we talk about mirror neurons that we should maybe consider. And these are highly specialized neurons that will, I think when someone yawns, right, and you're watching them, what do you feel prompted?
Most of the time we yawn.
Right? I remember that in class, in grad school especially, we're all just kind of sitting there watching each other, and it's contagious, right?
Yeah.
It goes around. Or in a meeting, if someone kind of scratches at their nose,
you start to feel a little itchy.
Yeah. And that's mirror neurons at play.
Yeah. Well, I think about it even when you're sitting with somebody and, the way that we sort of naturally attune to and match somebody's, mood state. If you're sitting with someone who is smiling at you so brightly and they are just so enthused, it's hard to not match that and to not smile back. And our mirror neurons get so activated in that moment because we are, wanting to really meet where that other person's at. Same way for if somebody's talking to you and they're very quiet and they're very solemn and they're very serious. Generally, if we are tuned in and maybe have a high level of empathy, we are meeting them at that same, we're talking in a same cadence. We're talking in a same, volume or rhythm. And we don't have to think about any of that. This is all just happening.
Well, there's some mixed research. Are we born with them? Do they develop over time? In the last, I think some neuroscience from the last 10 years prior might say, yeah, we were born with them and they actually help us even as young, just out of the womb, to reflect and respond to our parents' behaviors. Think about a baby or a mother who's coddling and holding her baby, and she goes and opens her mouth and makes a warm, loving look on her face, and the 6-month-old or the 4-month-old may try and mimic the same.
Yeah, that's how babies learn to smile.
Yep.
It's through those mirror neurons.
Yep.
We're constantly smiling at, our baby and looking them in the eyes, and then they start to do that same thing.
Yeah. Yeah. And more recent research has shown that, yes, they do develop over time as well. And so I think where I land on it is that mirror neurons, although we have them, we have to actually practice. Right. We need to use them. We need to allow them to work. If we don't, then I think it can be harder to have them work reflexively.
Yeah. Well, and if you think about them, they're sort of like these, as Alex was saying before, these specialized brain cells, and they're going to be activated when you see someone else do something. And while it can help us understand somebody else's feelings and actions, kind of like this, copy paste function for our emotions and experiences, we do need to have the language for that and the emotional intelligence to be able to connect that to something greater, or even just the ability to become conscious of it. Because again, a lot of this is an unconscious process that's happening in the background. We may not be, even really aware that this is something that we could even practice or grow in.
Sure.
Because it's just sort of happening. So getting into the research, like you said, we have them, we're born with them, and we develop them. So with a lot of things, there's a nature and nurture function to it.
Yes, I agree there. Okay, mirror neurons, we're finding they're strongly associated with empathy, right? Yeah. Imagine that, someone is just having a down day, right? And you see them maybe sad and crying, and you watch and you feel that, right? You feel that. That's your mirroring neurons at play, right? That's your ability to take their experience and make sense of that. And what we do see, if we were to do like an fMRI, we would see the part of the brain that is processing emotion also lighting up there. The amygdala might be lighting up. And that's because we are kind of going through that with that other person. Now, I think the other side of this is we've also found that this could be a place where judgment comes from.
I did not know that.
Yeah. While mirror neurons allow us to comprehend someone else's emotional experience, we may not always be in agreement with that emotional experience. Right? I want you to think, for example, if we were maybe raised in a household that really didn't focus on emotions, or maybe where a household where, maybe living by the motto of, oh, boys don't cry, or don't be dramatic, don't make a big deal out of something. You're overreacting, right? Where maybe emotions are suppressed, or just it's not okay to be open with them, right? So here you are, you have that history, and that's wired into your brain, right? Your brain has grown around that experience. But then you see someone else going through that.
It's really interesting.
Yeah.
Well, it really, goes to show too how our early experiences, or just life experiences, I think in general, whether they are, typical life experiences or maybe even more traumatic life experiences, how they really play a role in how we deal, how empathy actually functions for us, because, whether or not it's a connective experience, like I see someone who's really sad and I really realize, they are feeling this way, and I'm maybe even experiencing a bit of that discomfort and pain. Well, the next response of, what have we been raised with, or what have we sort of learned in our lifetime, that really predicts then what we do with the mirror neurons that we might be experiencing, the empathy that we might be feeling, or the discomfort that we might be experiencing. A lot of people find it very uncomfortable to see someone else experiencing emotion because they themselves maybe don't have some of that emotion regulation. That they've learned.
I want you to think, as we were saying before, so these mirror neurons allow for our brain to kind of process and experience or make sense of someone else's emotional experience, right? So what we see in the brain scans is that, well, if someone is experiencing happiness or joy and we observe that and we're like attuned to that, our brain can have that same process. We experience joy. Well, we see someone who, as an example, gets yelled at and starts to cry. And if we grew up in a family, again, where that wasn't okay, or that was frowned upon, or we were judged ourselves for that, well, that empathy may kind of backfire for us in a way of how we would anticipate empathy working.
Yeah.
Right? We may say, oh, I'm feeling the same sense of sadness or the same despondency there, and that's uncomfortable to me. I don't like that.
Yeah.
Well, we may then judge that person as being, oh, they're too sensitive.
Yeah.
Right? They're not strong enough because of our own discomfort with it.
Yeah. Well, I think that whole idea really is very interesting, because then, it kind of brings into mind something that I think is really, sort of backs into empathy, which is sort of that like secondhand embarrassment experience, where you might see someone, for example, someone's giving like a presentation and they start to kind of stumble or stutter, or they're just like struggling through it. Yeah, of course. I mean, nobody is perfect. But if that's something that in our own life, we're like really shielded, from doing ourselves, or maybe we've gotten really poor feedback in the past, or just, maybe there's just like, yeah, no, that's not okay. And we are judging them. Then our mirror neurons might make us start to feel this sort of secondhand embarrassment. And then instead of like, just experiencing that discomfort or feeling like, oh gosh, I really like feel for that person, which might be that empathic response. We might be like, wow, that person's, look at them. They're really awkward. They didn't really prepare for this. We might place that judgment on them, which, is really antithetical to empathy.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, you saying that makes me, what's the term? Cringe, right? Which the younger folks have been using for a while now. But my understanding of if something is cringy or has
that's so cringe.
Yeah, so cringe is that it's an experience where you observe it, or you would look at it or understand it and feel like that. Ugh.
Like, wow, if that was me, I'd be, so embarrassed, and it's a very judgmental, nothing against that motto or whatever, any, people who are using it, but it's that and I think it's, a human experience. Judgments are obviously just a part, unfortunately, of just our lives, and they're a shortcut, they're a cognitive shortcut that a lot of us use, but because they're so specific and because they're so geared to our personal life experiences, and society and things like that, you've got a lot of different people who might think something is really cringe, where somebody else might say, well, maybe that's just like a person who's having a bad day. Like, is it really, is it something to judge or not? Like, what does that do?
Well, and so Ashley, you bring up a couple of points there that I want to try and remember here for myself. But you said it's judgment is a cognitive shortcut, and I want to come back to that.
Yeah.
However, I also want to jump to, I think the way we were just describing cringe is outward focused, right? But I would imagine for a lot of us, if we spend enough time and think about it, there's maybe that inward focused cringe, right? Like, I'm reflecting on my own past experience, and how could I have said that, or how could I have done that? Things like middle school, when, you're trying to talk to the person you like, and you just like stumble, and you're like, I made myself look like such a fool. So you're thinking about that. Right. And what part of your brain is becoming active? Well, it's the emotional centers of the brain.
Yeah,
you're reflecting on that. Yeah. And so I can see how this can play out, right? We look at that, and then we judge that experience just as we would maybe for somebody else, as we observe someone else do something, because we feel uncomfortable about it. It brings up that same uncomfortable discomfort, or same, sense of it's wrong or shouldn't happen.
All those shoulds. Well, and just as a total sidebar, I just want to say this about judgments, because, we often, we use them, again, just because our society is what it is, and our learning is what it is. I mean, again, judgments are not something that we can easily avoid, and they're just a part of kind of our lives in many ways, because they are a heuristic. But I always explain to folks, there's like 3 reasons that judgments exist, or 3 functions to them. We could say it like that. They're kind of myths, but they do sort of, we think that they work in this capacity. At first,
real quick, can you give an example of a judgment, so we can have judgment or not something that's not?
An example I give a lot is like, let's say I'm looking in the fridge and I say, the meat is bad. That's a judgment. I'll get into why I'm using that as the judgment in just a minute. So it's a shortcut, right? I'm just looking in there and saying, the meat's bad, but it's a shortcut. So it doesn't really give you any information. Like, you don't actually know from me saying that whether or not it's like gone bad. Is it like past its expiration? Like, it's bad, you can't eat it? Or is it like bad because it's the type of meat I didn't want? Like, you got ham and I prefer turkey or whatever. It's a shortcut, but it leaves out vital information that otherwise, we would need to sort of describe really what's going on. So it's a fairly non-descriptive shortcut. And then there's two other reasons that we use judgments, and that's because we want to control our own behavior and we want to control other people's behaviors. And so I use this example a lot in my work because I work with folks with eating disorders. So maybe some people will relate to this, but there's a lot of people who will look in the mirror and say to themselves, God, I'm really fat. That's a judgment.
Yeah.
We might not be using that in a descriptive, fact-based way because it may be a subjective statement that we're using. And, that we might do that in this sort of effort to change our behavior. Oh, well, if I tell myself that, then I'll make better choices and I'll exercise more and I'll take care of my health. Obviously, that's a myth. That does not work like that. It actually just perpetuates a shame cycle. But we feel like in that moment, here's something I can do to snap myself, kick myself into gear, right?
It's easy.
Yeah. If I judge myself, then maybe I'll change. Unfortunately, it doesn't work like that.
Sure.
And then we also judge other people in an effort to get them to change. If you call somebody else fat or lazy or whatever, unprepared, awkward, like we said before, oh, well, that judgment will help them to change themselves. Obviously, again, these are myths. It doesn't work like that. If anything, it keeps people very much stuck in negative cycles or negative behaviors or just negative thinking patterns. But that's sort of the purpose, the reason why we have these very ineffective judgments.
Yeah. So it's not a judgment of judgment in the sense of, oh, should I cross the street at this point in time or not? More so it's a judgment of, as you're talking about, Ashley, it's judgment of this is something that I believe about something else.
Yeah, I would say judgments really kind of follow a particular pattern because they usually have components to them something is good or bad, something is right or wrong. Judgments usually follow this sort of, I would say, a dualistic kind of way of thinking where it's either something's kind of, it can go in two categories and that's sort of it. And that's why judgments can be so limiting, kind of like black and white thinking or all or nothing thinking. It's very much because you can have a positive judgment. Your kid can bring home a test that they got an A on. You can be like, wow, this is so good. And that would be a positive judgment. I mean, that might not necessarily be a bad thing.
Yeah. But you're right. You're right. And I guess it is subjective and a moving target in a sense. And the reason I bring that up is because, and maybe I said this before in a prior podcast, when I was younger, I had sort of misconstrued judgments and would apply one blanket definition. Mm-hmm. Right. And so we're not talking about a judgment of, again, trying to cross the road at the right time, or a judgment of this costs this much, I don't want to pay that much. So, judging in a decision, more so it sounds like it is judging based upon your perspective of something, your understanding it's right or wrong, good or bad, and there might be a moral or ethical implication to it.
Yeah, there's usually some kind of value-based decision that we're making in that moment when we label something. And I mean, just think about it sometimes this is hard. This is the hard work that's required of trying to be a more empathic or more socially conscious person. But just think about the thoughts that run through your mind as you go through your day and you encounter people that you see. There's judgments that exist there. And I think a lot of people aren't tuned into them. But even think about what judgments you might have or thoughts you might have. It's uncomfortable, but when, let's say, you're driving down the street and you see somebody who is unhoused and they are standing by, in the corner with a sign that says, anything helps and I'm hungry. Mm-hmm. A lot of people have judgments about that. We have to be honest about those things. That's, it. And we're going to get into how our judgments actually contribute to something called empathic failure. And I think this kind of actually segues into it quite nicely, which is where we don't really understand somebody else's like feelings, thoughts, perceptions, or even like where they're coming from. Like, I feel like this can happen a lot. And I don't know, you tell me if you feel like this even connects, but like we can have judgments that interfere with our ability to connect, even with like our kids. Like, right? Like in parenting, it's such an interesting practice to really give your kids the benefit of the doubt.
Uh-huh.
And there's like, I don't know if you ever experienced this growing up or like as a kid, but like, do you ever recall a situation where like you were like, you're legitimately like just doing your best. You're a kid. You don't really have like maybe a reference for things. And then somebody assumes that you like purposefully did something wrong. Maybe it was like an accident, but it's assumed that you did it on purpose and that you had like malintent.
I have a story I can share.
Okay, let's hear.
Yeah. Okay. So it was middle school, 6th grade, right? First year there, and my friend from elementary school, he had gone to a different school, and then finally, after I think like 3 years, we had come back and we were in the same class together. And it's going to be a silly example, but he shows up to school and he was wearing his sister's coat. He and his sister had some squabbles in the past, and it was just a colder day. I think it was a coat that was available. He's like, "Oh, you know what? You should just spit on it." So it was at recess, so we were playing. I was like, "Okay," and so poor executive functioning me spit on his jacket. Well, a teacher saw that and said, "What are you doing? You can't spit on," and had thought initially that I was spitting on him because maybe we were having a squabble or a fight or something. And I tried to explain, he actually told me to do it. And so, I think I got like a referral or something from that. But
that's a good example. Well, and I think too, it even changes like how we respond in those moments and how like, if you think about it, like I can tell with my children, if I can tell how it impacts them, the difference between, why did you do that? Why would you have thought to do something like that? That kind of response versus, okay, let's sort of figure this out together. And like me going into it with this idea of like, I know that you are a good kid at your core and like, you don't want to make decisions that are, poor decisions. You aren't trying to do that. Like kids, and this is kids as a whole, they're good. They're born good. Nobody wants to, do things that are going to get them in trouble. But, we can get sometimes just in our day to day, that sort of mentality of like, why is my kids misbehaving all the time? Why are they doing this? Why do they, sort of always choose to not follow the rules? And it's like, we don't give them that benefit of the doubt. We're judging them in the moment as trying to be malicious or not listen or sort of purposeful through their, what we might look at as like misbehavior or something like that. But that is empathic failure in that regard, because we are not looking through the lens of like, this is a child who's trying their best, but we can do that with other people, with other groups. We can do that with, like I said before, the example I used of somebody who is unhoused. We might make all sorts of judgments. They actually did a research study. We'll get into the research a little bit on something that's a little bit more extreme, but they've done research even on how people will avert their eyes from somebody who, is on the side of the road to limit the discomfort that they would normally, naturally, just as a human, feel because of empathy, because of mirror neurons, because of these processes. And we will engage in acts that are actually considered dehumanizing, averting someone's gaze, not looking at them, ignoring them. Those are, very subtle, but dehumanizing tactics that we do in an effort to reduce our own discomfort.
You're really calling us out here.
We all do this. Unfortunately, it's something that as human beings we do, and we have to understand it. And we're going to get into something a little more specific regarding hate speech. But these behaviors actually deteriorate the neurocognitive mechanisms that we're talking about that allow us to feel empathy. And that is important because this is pervasive in our society.
Yeah. So I want to bring us back to, again, how this process works, right? So we observe something, and based on our own like experience and upbringing, we will make meaning of that. So as you're saying, I'm a house person on the side of the road. Well, we look at them or we see them and we say, well, that person isn't working hard enough, or that person could just go and get a job, or that person has maybe there's drugs or
maybe they're choosing to use drugs or alcohol, which that brings in a whole other can of worms that we don't need to get into today. But, that there's sort of this blame that is put on there, which I think is really interesting. It gets into a lot of things around, I've been doing a lot of research on things like sort of the abuse cycle and power control and blaming and blaming, denial, and there's another one that I'm missing in there. Those are really key tactics in terms of maintaining a power dynamic over someone, or creating a sort of a dynamic where you are, again, this goes back to judgments, in your mind better than somebody else. They are somehow lower now than you, which that's a very judgmental, again, kind of viewpoint of humans, rather than through empathy, we might feel like we are all on an equal playing field. Yeah, in this together. Yes. You've got, with judgments, a more, a system where there is a hierarchy and someone's above somebody else. And so we might look at people as being below or above us, in some capacity, typically below us, because that's what judgments will, they help to elevate you in some sense by judging others.
Sure. Well, and it sounds like at the root of this, as we look at judgment, and maybe before we get into the neurocognitive mechanisms, at the root of a lot of this is maybe discomfort with our own emotions and discomfort with seeing other people go through difficult emotions and difficult circumstances. And so to make sense of it all, I think judgment can come in, right? It, as you said, it's a heuristic, it's a shortcut. And so we make sense of, why is this person sitting on the side of the road, not working? Well, that's a scary thing. If I imagine myself in that situation, I don't like that.
And I don't even want to do it. So a lot of times we just avoid it. And that is, I think we don't realize, and I guess I didn't really even think about it like this until we started to dive into this topic of empathy, but I don't know if I ever thought about that before, that function of judgment serving as a way to also, like, that is empathic failure. Like, in judging, we now have failed at empathy. We've created a situation where now we are creating a disconnection relationally.
Yeah. And I do want to say, to clarify, not a failure to be able to empathize, but a failure maybe how that plays out at the end.
A misunderstanding. Maybe that's the way, like the way we're describing or defining empathic failure here is like when we misunderstand or don't understand another person's like feelings or thoughts, their perceptions, their life experiences, because we're not really tuned in. And again, a lot of this is unconscious. So I want to be sure we're not blaming, we're really being very careful to also give everybody, every listener, and ourselves a sort of benefit of the doubt. We're all doing the best with what we have right in front of us and with our life, currently as it is. I firmly do believe that, in my work and as a psychologist and just as a human, I believe that we are all trying our best. But sometimes there are those, as we've called them before, these sort of mistaken beliefs, these sort of misunderstandings that we get kind of wrapped up in and that we don't even realize maybe sometimes, like, this is not working for me. This is serving to keep me separated, from someone else or, a group of people even.
Well, and this does happen naturally as well. And I think, so the empathic failure, like as a concept, comes out of psychotherapy, right? As a therapist, to be able to empathize with your patient or your client. Yeah. It is really important. However,
and we make mistakes too sometimes, I
always want to admit it, but
we do. Sometimes you check in, you're like, is this kind of what you're describing? And hopefully you have a good enough relationship with your patients where they can be like, actually, no. And sometimes that happens. Sometimes there's that missing, of each other. But
that's also human.
That is human.
And that well, again, I think it naturally happens. And as a therapist, as a psychologist, I can't speak for you, but I try to, and I think you do this, but I try to self-correct from that without avoiding, but to acknowledge, okay, this is how I saw it. Here's how it's being stated to me. Okay, let's make sense of that. And, we can examine that at another time, or maybe use that as a way to understand our own biases, but to be open to that and not to bury our head in the sand.
Absolutely. Well, as a total side note, if there's any therapists listening, this is the basis of countertransference, understanding how your own belief system, your own judgments, your own life experiences play a role in how you see things, like what lens you're looking through. And that is I think, like the basis of countertransference. You have to be able to recognize like what is getting in the way of my attunement with the person who's sitting in front of me, and what lens am I wearing? What is coloring my viewpoint here where I missed, where there was a missed opportunity for that empathy, what we might call that, empathic failure. But that is countertransference, not a word that most people have ever encountered before or even need to know. But that's something that we have to do as therapists to make sure we're not missing the mark. Because, maybe some of you have experiences of going to a therapist or someone who you've talked to, and like, it's really unhelpful because they're sitting with you and they're totally missing you and they're not getting anything you're saying, or they just seem like they're not really like, they're with you on the same page. And that is like the sort of misattunement that we're talking about, like really just not getting it. So anyway, hopefully there's not too many people that have had that experience, but should we dive into?
Yeah, especially before you brought up that there are some things that can kind of cause empathic failure or get in the way of empathy. And curious.
Well, so I found this study yesterday, actually. It's from 2023, and it's about how exposure to hate speech actually deteriorates these neurocognitive mechanisms in our ability to understand, other people's pain. So like, decoding that, basically how when we are exposed to something like hate speech, what that does to our empathy. And what does that do to sort of this experience of being in like the in-group or the out-group? And so basically, in short, I'll just do a quick summary and then, we can kind of dive into the discussion about it and everything. But hate speech can, and this sort of makes sense, right? Can make people care less about the pain of those people who are outside their own group.
That makes sense.
Yeah. And so this study specifically was using brain scans. I believe they were using fMRIs to look at how other people, or to look at how the people in the study reacted to others' suffering after hearing hate speech. So it really was measuring empathy. It was having people sort of observe like somebody who was hurt or who was in suffering, and then looking at the parts of their brain that lit up. Because a lot of times when we observe somebody who is, hurt or in some way in pain, the same receptors and the same areas of our brain that would light up if we were the ones, who were experiencing that pain will light up. And so what happened in this study was that when people were exposed to these hateful words about this other group, their brains actually showed less activity in the areas linked to empathy, especially from those who were from different groups. And this really, what this means, what does this mean in real life? Hearing hate speech can actually make someone feel less for others. So, and this goes back to what we're talking about, right? Judgments, this is on the extreme end of judgments. Hate speech, is really extreme judgments at their worst. In short, hateful words aren't just hurting feelings. They actually will change how our brain neurocognitively responds to other people's suffering. I feel like that is information that, that's really powerful.
I think that aligns a lot with what I wrote a blog post maybe December, just about how, like in online forums, right, there was sort of a shift to more extreme views that have happened in echo chamber type forums. And where someone could start out by saying, I don't believe in this, all of a sudden it's, we need to do, something extreme now because it just keeps moving more to the right or to the left or up or down or wherever. And that's a little bit of what I'm hearing here is that when exposed to hate speech, okay, we are less empathetic to others' experiences.
Yes. And I think, so this brings up the whole in-group, out-group dynamics. And so we don't have to dive super deep into this. I mean, an in-group is a group that you belong to, an out-group is a group that you don't belong to. In this sort of, example that we're talking about, it can also be referred to as things like othering,
us first.
Or us first them. Yes. So really, again, like sort of division, and it goes into like our perceptions. And so, what we might believe or be prone to believing and perceiving about other groups versus our own, the own, your own personal groups that you belong to. And so I think like naturally, sometimes with, groups we're not as familiar with, like something, like an out group, we might be a little bit more careful or alert. We might have those sensors up to be more attuned, like just kind of check in. But it doesn't mean that inherently we as people, as human beings, just inherently look at an out group as like bad or dangerous or less than. We're not like, as human beings, we don't come out automatically judging. This is definitely a learned behavior. And this, you can view this with children. I think children are a great way to do this. I mean, unless they have been really like in their own home, been hearing a lot of judgments, which is more atypical, I would say. Then for the most part, children who grow up in a more typical home are very non-judgmental. And you can probably see this with young kids who like, they just don't even really think about, other people being bad or dangerous. That's why there's so much talk about, protecting children with stranger danger. That's why that was such a thing. Like kids will go off, with a person who's like, hey, come and look at all the puppies in my van, because children are so naturally curious and non-judgmental. And so we don't just do this as human beings, like view other people as bad, but through that socialization of that, then, it's when we start to see other groups as like a threat or as a danger that we become more aggressive, more violent, more hateful. And so I think that that's really interesting because we've seen, like Alex was saying, a lot of this socially, politically, we've just seen a lot of this sort of hateful rhetoric that's been, I think, really damaging in terms of our relationships or us as a society.
Well, and as you're saying that, Ashley, I was thinking about just some of the research that we've seen for like infants and young kids, right? We're not born like with a fear of snakes, right?
No.
So put a kid and a snake together and the kid's going to be interested in it, try and play with it. Whereas adults were like, ooh, that's a snake. And
get that away from me.
Yeah. And so we develop this sense of dangerous or a threat, over time.
Yeah.
And I think that's what you're talking about here, though, Ashley, is that over time as we're more exposed to hate speech, or we're more exposed to extreme views that maybe press the idea that the out group or the other group is dangerous, or somehow less than, or I think even back to like Nazi Germany, where they would talk about other cultures as not even human anymore. Yeah,
the dehumanizing is something that really contributes to some of this. That's, a dehumanization. The dehumanization strategies go hand in hand a lot of times with things like hate speech, because that's the function of it, right? Is to dehumanize. Which again, this goes like it's hand in hand with judgment. It's opposition, in opposition to empathy. It's interesting. It's like also in opposition to like curiosity. Sort of the natural human experience is one of curiosity. Like you said, you put a snake in with a kid. I mean, yeah, like maybe they'll be a little cautious, depending on how they're, raised and what their parents are like and that kind of thing. Like, as the parent one who's like kind of fearful and like, oh, watch out, or are they just sort of curious and like interested. And I think that that's our natural way of being as humans is curious and, like kids want to know what's going on in their world.
Sure.
And we get that in a lot of ways, like almost desensitized or almost like bred out of us through these judgments, through,
Absolutely.
the things that we learn or hear over time. Yeah.
Yeah, I think, and this is something that in media, online, we kind of hear it and see it every day,
Yeah.
right? Where there's a new, we need to be afraid of this, or we need to be worried about that. And it does, I think, when we don't stop to maybe question, or we don't stop to ask ourselves, like, why am I feeling this way about it?
Yeah.
Right. To get more in touch with what the emotional data, like our own emotional data, is saying about it, then we do rely on those judgments, as you were saying, Ashley, right? It's we take that shortcut there.
Oh, sure. Well, and again, why do we do that? Well, we're really cognitively overloaded. People are stressed. So they're not, I certainly have patients who, wonder out loud to me sometimes, when am I going to do all this, work I have to like go throughout my normal day? Like, how can I, sit and think through and contemplate and change, my cognitions on things? Well, yeah, that is really, it's exhausting. It's hard to be, mindful and aware and tuned in, all the time. I certainly wouldn't expect anybody to do that 100%. I mean, unless you're a monk and that's like what you do, you're just able to be in a metacognitive state. But most of us can't do that. I mean, we're stressed, we're busy, we're in our lives. So yeah, we're just going through it on autopilot a lot of times. And you hear all these fearful messages, and this group, is terrible. Look at them; they're all criminals. All these people, whatever it is, and then
These
people just
really
eat it up.
Working, and they're just taking a paycheck. And
yeah,
if we just trust those, what you're saying is, if we just trust those messages,
then we have less empathy. We are more divided. We are less able to really see people as maybe being on an equal playing field as we are. We sort of forget the humanity, I think, in a lot of this.
And I think back to during the pandemic, the commercials, was it like a Coca-Cola commercial or something, where it was like, we're all in this together, right? But that is the reality. We are all humans. We all bleed red blood, right? We all are born into this world, and we all have parents, whether they're alive or not. We all have other people around us.
Every adult was a child once upon a time. I always like to think about that, because sometimes, people like to make judgments about adults, and it's, we all have had experiences, difficult experiences. Nobody is separate from that. We might make really wide generalizations and, once again, judgments about certain groups of people. I would really encourage anyone listening to this to think about, have you ever been told, or have you adopted these sort of views, about certain people, about, people who are different from you, about, people who you might see as like a threat, or, I just think that all of these biases, in the end, they do reduce empathy. They make us more likely to be separate, to feel disconnected, and to really, again, dehumanize the sort of people in that group. And then that can lead people to feeling like they can justify harm, against that group. Oh, it's okay if those people suffer. No, we're all human.
I wonder, you had said, I think you had attributed it to Brene Brown the other day, but it's hard to hate up close.
I love that quote.
Yeah. And it makes me think okay, if people were truly aware of how the difficulties and the challenges, or the troubles, or just how hurt we can, some people can be by what other people have put them through, right? If that makes sense.
Yeah,
if we would still maybe say the same things about maybe that other group or the other group.
Yeah, because yeah, if you think about it, like we have so many keyboard warriors and, it's so easy behind a screen to just be anonymous and say whatever nonsense and judgments and things that people put out there. It's so easy to do that. But when you're face to face with somebody and you're hearing their story, and maybe you start to become privy to obstacles that person, maybe because of their outgroup status, the obstacles they've faced. Maybe there's systemic issues, at play here, things that have kept them in their life from being able to, on a judgmental level, do the same things that you maybe have done. I think when we start to really connect with people and actually know who they are on a personal level, it's really hard to hate someone because I would argue that it is against our human nature to do that. That as human beings, we are driven to connect with each other.
We are social creatures, and if we want to look at it, I think from an evolutionary perspective, right? We made it out of the caves as a team.
Yeah. And we had to do that as a team. I mean, my gosh, you couldn't operate divisively. I mean, everybody had to be like part of the network. Everybody had to participate in a certain role in order for the group at large to survive. I mean, everybody knew what role they played, and you had to show up. And if you didn't, there would be some type of consequence, and then maybe some type of learning, opportunity so that you could get back in the group, or you'd be, pushed out of the group. And I don't really know, obviously caveman times.
Dynamics, but
yeah,
I think that it's easy when we are separated and disjointed and closed off from one another to continue to believe that this is the way the world is, that it's dangerous, and that everyone outside of my, social circle needs to be questioned, and I need to be suspicious of them.
I just had this thought, and I know we're coming to a close, on this topic, but I just had this thought about the tribe, and I apologize. I actually could look it up. Well, I don't have it on me right now. I'll have to look it up at a different time and give you guys the information for it. But there is a tribe that exists present day, and their practice in their tribe community is when somebody in their group messes up, makes a mistake or otherwise does something that's against their rules or their social norms, they don't shun them. They don't turn them away. Instead, their practice is to have them sit in the center of a large circle, and everyone from the village and from the community comes and sits around them and tells them all the wonderful things about them. And to me, that almost makes me cry because they sit with them for days. And these are people who are hurting, who probably feel, guilt maybe about what they've done or about what hurts they've caused or whatever they've done. And rather than them being viewed as any type of other, they are held in pure empathy and love. And they reintegrate them back into the group after this process, but they spend an entire day talking to them about all the wonderful qualities that they have. And I think, oh my gosh, how would our world be different if we did something like that?
Right. Well, I think that relates directly to failure, and empathy as well relates to how maybe we deal with or don't deal with, right? On the other side of empathy is that judgment, how we might criticize failure, and why then failure has taken on such the role that it has in our society.
Yeah. It really makes you think too, a reliance on judgment. Is that this failure toward connection and relationships and empathy? Because empathy, as we started off saying, and I want to revisit this idea, studies have shown that people who have higher levels of empathy are actually happier. They're happier in their lives. They're happier in their relationships. They are happier at work. They are, more productive. They are healthier. And that to me, I mean, we have to come back to that because
Wouldn't it be nice to have all those things?
I know, seriously, wouldn't it be nice?
All we got to do is have empathy then.
Yeah. As a group, we need to practice that. And that's something that, it's easy to practice in the sense that all you have to do is get in front of another human being and practice like feeling into them in that sense of feeling what it's like to be in their shoes and really like putting yourself in their position.
So I was going to ask with that in mind, for our listeners, Ashley, what are some things that they can do to practice empathy, to be more empathic?
Well, I think making it a practice, like making it a point and being very aware, like I said, like it could be through your conversations with your friends or your partner. It's like making an effort to give people the benefit of the doubt and listen. I think curiosity, again, is like a great segue into learning how to be empathic, because when you're curious, you are opening your mind and you're doing less judging. Again, judging is that shortcut, quick way of thinking. So it's really helpful to be aware of our judgments, but to also not get too caught up in that process and to really stay more curious. It like taps into a different, mindset. And so by being curious, you're able to be more attuned, you're able to be more present. And through that, you can open yourself up to being more aware of what somebody is going through. And I think you can, like, really, again, it's practicing. Like, how do you practice being, like, putting yourself into somebody else's shoes and imagining what it's like to be in their life and just to be them, to practice thinking about what it's like to be somebody other than who you are. I mean, that's kind of the exercise in it, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
I would also think that if we can recognize our own judgments,
yes,
right, if we are prone to maybe having very quick responses to things or to saying, this is exactly what it is, maybe it would be helpful then to, in an effort to be more empathic, to either delay or slow that down or stop that, so that we can then respond differently.
Absolutely. Well, and I think, one of my favorite supervisors from the past, when I was learning DBT, which is really like, we talk about judgments a lot in DBT because we practice being non-judgmental. That's a cornerstone of mindfulness, just as a side note. So you really, really have to get into like, what are your judgments and identifying them and just like knowing what they are, not to try and like necessarily do a lot of reworking of them or challenging them, but really just to notice them and kind of let them fade. But one of the things that I remember her saying was, don't judge the judgments. And that's something that I think is a real part of this practice too, is learning how to be non-judgmental toward yourself, because I think it's really easy when we actually start to tune in. I think it's easy to start to judge ourselves and be like, why am I such a judgmental person? Why do I hold these beliefs? Like that says something about me.
Like being too focused on it, you make a thing out of it.
Yeah. And really it's, I think we have to just look at this as, it's just a way of operating in the society that we live in. And maybe it's not super like normal in the sense that, it's not probably the most effective way to go about being a human. It is something that's just a part of our culture. And so you can't beat yourself up over that. You have to learn to like let that go and have self-compassion and recognize, like, once again, I'm doing my best just as other people are too. And not beat yourself up for whatever judgments you start to notice. I mean, this is an opportunity for growth. And so rather than getting hung up on the judgment and, oh my gosh, I'm a bad person for thinking this way about, that person who I just passed on the road, like, no, just recognize it. And then, you can ask yourself, does that make me feel less connected to that person? Probably, yeah. So how can I like start to shift from that and stop viewing other people as threats, stop viewing other people as dangerous, unless you have some data to support that. But most of us are not just in our daily life interacting with numerous criminals and people who are going to harm us in that capacity. So,
and I think talking about all this makes me think a lot about guilt and shame. And I think earlier you had mentioned guilt. So maybe that'll be a topic for next time.
Yeah. I hope this was helpful for all of you. I hope you can pay attention to your judgments, not judge them. Practice
empathy.
Yeah. Putting yourself in somebody else's shoes, and maybe you can let us know what that experience was like for you. Or maybe what you even learned, because I think that that's one of the coolest parts of, being a human, is just every day you can kind of learn some new information about yourself. And again, I think that curiosity is really important. This is like an opportunity just to learn about you so you can learn how to be a good human and love other people well and support other people and
make changes.
Yeah. Be like a good human. So it's part of that process. But yeah, we're all trying the best that we can. And I think we are. Let's, maybe end on that note of, we recognize that everybody is very much doing the best that they can with what they have and with the way things are today. So we'll end on that note.
You can find us on Substack at The Colors of Failure. You can also find us on YouTube and Spotify. And if you are listening, on any of those platforms, we invite you just to follow us and give us a like. And we just want to thank you for listening.
Yes, thank you for listening. Have a great day.